The dust settled last, a fine red powder coating everything that had stopped moving and everything that had never moved at all, laying a uniform blanket of silence over the end of the world. A woman stepped down from the stagecoach, her foot hesitating for a second over the packed earth as if testing its solidity, her hand a white-knuckled grip on the iron rail beside the door. She wore a dress the color of a faded sky, its dark blue worn thin at the elbows and the collar, a traveler's dress meant for a journey that was now definitively over. Her face was turned away from the town, looking back along the twin ruts the coach had carved into the plain, as if she could still see the place she had come from, a place that no longer existed for her except as a memory of motion. The driver, a man whose face was a collection of sun-baked creases, swung her small trunk down from the roof with a grunt and let it drop into the dust with a thud that seemed louder than it should have been in the vast, waiting quiet of the afternoon. She flinched, a small, barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. But it was there. She turned then, and the town saw her face for the first time, a face pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed too large and too dark for its delicate frame, eyes that took in the unpainted clapboard of the mercantile, the saloon with its bat-wing doors hanging slightly askew, and the long, low shape of the livery stable at the far end of the street, all without seeming to focus on any one thing. She pulled the sleeves of her dress down, further over her wrists, a needless gesture as they already covered her completely, and she held her hands clasped in front of her, a small, worn valise clutched between them like a shield. From the cool, shadowed mouth of that livery stable, Silas watched. He did not stop his work, his hands moving with a slow, practiced economy as he stitched a split trace, the waxed thread pulling tight with a soft hiss against the leather. His hands were broad and calloused, the knuckles scarred from a lifetime of work with horses and harnesses and the unforgiving material of this land. But they were steady, and they were patient. He saw the way the woman stood alone in the middle of the street, an island in a sea of dust, and he saw the way the town watched her from behind parted curtains and from the doorways of their businesses, their gazes curious and assessing and ultimately indifferent. They were used to arrivals. They were used to departures. A mail-order bride was little more than a piece of freight, delivered and signed for. Silas's gaze was different, not because it was kinder, but because it was more thorough. He saw the worn-out soles of her shoes, the faint tremor in her hands, and the way she held her neck, a rigid column of tension beneath the tight knot of her dark hair. He had seen that same tension in a horse that had been beaten, a deep-seated expectation of a blow that made it shy away from any sudden movement, any raised hand. He pulled the stitch tight, his awl pressing a new hole in the thick leather, and he did not look away when a man finally emerged from the assayer's office. A man dressed in a fine wool coat despite the oppressive heat, his boots polished to a high shine. The man, Fletcher, did not smile. He walked toward the woman, his steps measured and proprietary, and stopped a few feet from her, looking her up and down as if inspecting a mare he was considering for purchase. He said something Silas could not hear, his voice a low murmur that did not carry, and the woman gave a small, jerky nod, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of his gleaming boots. Fletcher gestured toward her trunk with a flick of his chin, then turned and started walking toward the small, tidy house at the edge of town, the one with the white picket fence that was always freshly painted. He did not offer to carry her trunk. He did not take her arm. He simply walked, expecting to be followed. After a long moment, the woman bent down, her back stiff, and wrestled the heavy trunk up, dragging it behind her through the thick dust. Her name was Alara, though no one in the town knew it yet, and as she followed the man who was now her husband, she kept her head down, her world reduced to the sight of his straight back and the sound of her own breathing, ragged in the still, hot air. Silas watched until they were gone. Then he went back to his work. The stitch was perfect. Afternoon. The sun beat down on the town of Redemption, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the silence into the very timbers of the buildings. Silas worked in the relative cool of the livery, the familiar sense of hay and leather and horseflesh, a comforting constant in his life. His world was one of order, of tasks that had a clear beginning and a clear end, a thrown shoe to be replaced, a broken axle to be mended, a skittish colt to be gentled. He moved through his days with a deliberation that some mistook for slowness, but it was not slowness. It was precision. It was the careful husbanding of energy and motion that the land itself taught a man, the understanding that wastefulness of any kind, of words, of movement, of emotion, was a luxury one could not afford. He had come to Redemption 5 years before, a quiet man with nothing but a good horse and the skill in his hands, and he had built the livery from a derelict shell into the most solid business in town. He was respected for his work, for his fairness in a trade, and for the fact that he kept to himself. He asked no questions and offered no opinions, and in return, the town left him to his quiet solitude. He preferred it that way. The noise of other people's lives was a complication, a tangled knot he had no desire to unravel. He had seen enough of those knots in his own past, enough to know that pulling on one thread often only tightened the others. So he kept his head down, his focus on the task at hand, his world circumscribed by the wide doors of his stable. From this vantage point, he saw the town without being a part of it. He saw the ranchers come in for supplies, their talk of cattle prices, and the lack of rain a constant droning chorus. He saw the prospectors drift through, their eyes wild with a feverish hope that was almost always extinguished by the unforgiving hills. He saw the small dramas of the town play out in the street, the arguments, the flirtations, the quiet transactions of commerce and gossip. And he saw Lara. He saw her only in glimpses, brief snapshots of a life being lived behind a carefully constructed wall. He saw her at the mercantile, always a step behind Fletcher, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze never lifting from the floorboards. Fletcher would do the talking, his voice calm and reasonable, pointing to tins of peaches or a bolt of cloth, while Ilara stood silent and still, a shadow attached to his side. Silas noted that she always wore dresses with long sleeves, even now, as summer deepened and the heat became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the world from dawn until dusk. He saw her in the small garden she tended behind Fletcher's house, her back to the street as she pulled weeds or staked up tomato vines, her movements methodical and contained, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in the world. Once, he saw her at the far edge of town, near the creek, standing by a small copse of cottonwoods. She had thought she was alone. Her head was tilted back, her face turned up to the sky, and for a moment, the rigid control she held over herself seemed to fall away. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands unclasped, and she looked, for that one fleeting second, like a person who was simply breathing. Then Fletcher appeared. He had come up behind her, silent on the soft earth, and he placed a hand on her arm. From his place across the street, Silas could not hear what was said, but he saw the way Ilara flinched, the way her brief moment of peace shattered like glass. He saw Fletcher's fingers tighten on her arm, his grip not overtly violent but possessive, a gesture of ownership. He saw the way he pulled her back toward the house, his stride unbroken, his face a mask of cold displeasure, and he saw the look on Ilara's face as she was turned away from the sky and the trees, a look of such profound and desolate emptiness that it struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. He turned away, his jaw tight, and went back inside the livery. The image of her face burned into his mind. He picked up a heavy blacksmith's hammer, the smooth, worn wood of the handle familiar in his palm, and began to work on a piece of heated iron. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal, a futile attempt to drown out the silence that had followed her back to the house with the white picket fence. The iron glowed red, and he worked it until his shoulders ached, shaping it with a controlled violence that he could not and would not direct anywhere else. Days later, the pattern continued, a quiet rhythm of control and submission that played out in the small visible spaces of the town. Fletcher was a man of impeccable reputation. He was polite in his dealings, donated to the church building fund, and always had a civil word for his neighbors. His cruelty was a private thing, a currency spent only within the walls of his own home, and so it remained invisible to a town that did not wish to see it. They saw a well-dressed, successful man and his quiet, reserved wife. They saw order, they saw propriety. They did not see the way Ilara's eyes were always shadowed, the way she moved with a careful, guarded stillness, as if a sudden move might break something fragile within her. But Silas saw. He had a knack for seeing the things that were meant to stay hidden, the hairline fractures beneath a smooth surface. It was the same skill that allowed him to diagnose a horse's lameness from a slight hitch in its gait, or to know by the feel of a wagon wheel that an axle was about to give. He saw the truth in the small physical details that other people overlooked. He noticed that Ilara never bought anything for herself at the mercantile, only household goods. He noticed that when she walked, she kept her arms pressed tight against her sides. He noticed that she had stopped going to the creek, her brief escapes into the open air apparently forbidden. Her world had shrunk until it was only the house, the garden, and the short supervised walk to the center of town. She was a bird in a cage with invisible bars, a cage built of fear and isolation and the silent complicity of a town that minded its own business. One sweltering afternoon, the heat so intense that the air seemed to shimmer above the dusty street, Alara came to the livery. She came alone. This in itself was so unusual that Silas stopped what he was doing, a half-mended bridle held loosely in his hands. She stood in the doorway, framed by the bright, harsh sunlight, her form a dark silhouette against the glare. She hesitated there, as if gathering the courage to cross the threshold from the public street into the private space of his stable. Finally, she stepped inside, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim light. "Mr. Fletcher sent me," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "He said you have a gentle mare for sale." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze steady. He had a bay mare, placid and reliable, perfect for a lady's riding horse. He gestured toward the stall where the mare stood swishing her tail at the flies. "That one," he said. He did not ask why Fletcher had sent her alone or why they needed a second horse. He simply waited. Alara walked over to the stall, her movements still stiff and cautious. She reached out a hand, but stopped just short of touching the mare's soft nose, her fingers trembling slightly. She stood like that for a long moment, just looking at the animal, and Silas could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a longing so deep it was almost painful to witness. It was the longing for a connection, for a creature that would not judge or harm her, for a means of escape. She is very calm," Alara said, her voice still quiet. "Yes," Silas replied, "she is." She looked at the mare for another minute, then turned back to him, her expression once again guarded and neutral. "We will take her," she said, pulling a small leather purse from a pocket hidden in the folds of her dress. She fumbled with the drawstring, her fingers clumsy, and a few coins spilled onto the packed earth floor. She bent quickly to retrieve them, a flush of embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. As she stood back up, extending her hand to give him the money, the cuff of her long-sleeved dress slid back. It was only an inch, a tiny sliver of exposed skin, but it was enough. There, on the tender flesh of her inner wrist, was a bruise. It was not a fresh bruise, not the stark purple of a new injury, but the mottled, sickly, yellow-green of a wound that was beginning to heal. A stain that told a story of violence that was not a singular event, but a recurring one. A fingerprint of cruelty left behind. The world seemed to narrow to that single ugly mark. The lowing of the cattle in the nearby pens, the buzz of the flies, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, it all faded into a dull roar in Silas's ears. He looked from the bruise on her wrist to her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, sharp panic as she realized what he had seen. Her first instinct was to hide, to deny. She snatched her hand back, pulling her sleeve down with a jerky, frantic motion. But it was too late. The truth was out, lying there in the dusty space between them, a thing more solid and real than the coin she still clutched in her fist. Silas did not move. He did not react with anger or with pity. His face remained impassive, his expression unreadable, but a stillness had settled over him, a deep and dangerous quiet. He held her gaze, and for the first time, he saw past the fear to the person beneath it. The person who had stood by the creek and looked up at the sky. The person who was slowly being erased. He could have ignored it. He could have taken the money, completed the transaction, and let her walk back out into the blinding sunlight, back to her cage. That would have been the easy thing to do. It would have been the sensible thing to do. Minding his own business was the creed he lived by, the foundation of his quiet, orderly life. But the sight of that bruise, and the terror in her eyes as she tried to conceal it, had breached his defenses. It was a fracture in the world he had so carefully constructed, a wrongness that he could not unsee. He took a half step closer, not to threaten, but to close the distance, to make sure his words were for her and her alone. He lowered his voice until it was barely more than a breath of sound, a low rumble that would not carry past the two of them. He looked directly into her frightened eyes, and he spoke. "Who did this?" It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an accusation, and a demand rolled into one. It did not ask for information he already knew. It asked for an acknowledgement. It offered a witness. The three words hung in the thick, hot air of the stable, simple and plain and heavier than iron. Alara recoiled as if he had struck her. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a stark, waxy white. She shook her head, a series of short, frantic jerks, her eyes darting toward the open doorway as if plotting an escape. I fell," she stammered, the lie thin and brittle. "The steps. I am clumsy." She did not look at him as she said it, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. She thrust the money at him, the coins now slick with the sweat from her palm. "Please," she whispered, and the word was freighted with a desperate plea. Not for him to believe her lie, but for him to accept it, to let the matter drop, to retreat back into the comfortable silence of a stranger. She was terrified, not just of Fletcher, but of the hope, however small, that Silas's question represented. Hope was dangerous. It was a spark that could ignite a fire she was not sure she could survive. To acknowledge the truth of her life would be to make it real in a way she could no longer bear, and it would invite a confrontation she was certain she would lose. Silas looked at the money in her outstretched hand, then back at her face. He could see the war raging within her, the instinct for self-preservation battling against a flicker of desperate, exhausted defiance. He did not push. He did not repeat his question. He had planted a seed, and now he had to wait to see if it would take root in the barren soil of her fear. He slowly reached out and took the coins from her, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "The mare will be ready for you," he said, his voice back to its normal, even tone. "I will have a boy deliver her to your husband's house this evening." He had given her an out. He had allowed her to retreat behind her lie, to finish her errand and leave. He had shown her that he would not force her hand, that the choice was still hers to make. Alara seemed to sag with relief. She gave him another quick, jerky nod, then turned and fled from the stable, almost running back out into the harsh, unforgiving light of the street. She did not look back. Silas stood there for a long time, the coins warm in his hand, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the afternoon silence. He knew this was not the end of it. The question he had asked was still hanging in the air, unanswered but not unheard. He had drawn a line in the dust, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Fletcher would soon be coming to make him erase it. That night, the mare was delivered as promised. The next day, Fletcher came. He did not come alone. He was flanked by two men, hired hands from one of the larger ranches south of town. Men whose loyalty was bought with whiskey and coin, and whose knuckles were raw from frequent use. They did not walk into the livery with aggression, but with a kind of lazy, confident menace that was far more unsettling. Fletcher stopped just inside the doorway, the light behind him making it hard for Silas to see his face clearly, while his two companions fanned out, one leaning against a support beam, the other idly examining a horseshoe on the wall. It was a casual, calculated display of intimidation. "Silas," Fletcher said, his voice smooth and pleasant, as if he were merely paying a social call. "A fine mare you sold me. My wife is quite pleased." Silas continued to polish a piece of tack, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look up. "She's a good animal," he said, his voice flat. A silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Fletcher took a few steps further into the stable, his polished boots silent on the packed earth. "My wife is a delicate woman," Fletcher continued, his tone still conversational. "Newly arrived, you see, unfamiliar with our rougher ways. Sometimes she stumbles. She is not as steady on her feet as one might like." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "It is my duty, as her husband, to ensure her safety, to protect her." Silas finally stopped his work. He looked up, his gaze meeting Fletcher's across the shadowed space of the stable. Silas's eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held no fear. They were simply watching, waiting. "Is that so?" Silas said. It was not a question. Fletcher's smile was a thin, tight line that did not reach his eyes. "It is," he said, "which is why I find it peculiar that a man like you would take an interest in her well-being. A man who minds his own business, a man who keeps to himself." The hired man by the support beam pushed himself upright, cracking his knuckles. The sound was sharp and loud in the quiet stable. "Some might see such an interest as an overstep," Fletcher went on, his voice dropping slightly, losing its pleasant veneer and taking on a harder edge. "Some might see it as a man getting notions about things that do not concern him, things that are private, property, you might say." The word hung in the air. Property. He had reduced his wife to an object, a thing he owned and could treat as he pleased. Silas slowly placed the piece of tack he had been holding onto a nearby workbench. He turned his body to face Fletcher fully, his stance relaxed but rooted, like an old tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. He was not a large man, not compared to the two hired hands, but there was a density to him, a core of unyielding stillness that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "A man falls, he gets back up," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of conviction. "An animal falls, you help it. You see what's wrong, you fix it." He let his gaze drift from Fletcher to the two men flanking him. then back. It's a simple thing. Fletcher's facade of civility finally cracked. A flicker of raw anger showed in his eyes. "This is not your concern, stableman," he hissed. The word stableman meant as an insult, a reminder of Silas's place. "I am telling you, for your own good, to forget whatever you think you saw. My wife is my business. Redemption is a small town. Accidents can happen. A fire in a stable full of dry hay. It would be a terrible tragedy." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. Silas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply held Fletcher's gaze, his own expression unchanging. "Get out of my stable," he said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a finality that left no room for argument. For a moment, the tension was so thick it was almost a physical thing. The two hired hands tensed, ready to move on Fletcher's command. Fletcher stared at Silas, his jaw working, his mind clearly weighing the cost of escalating the confrontation here and now. He saw something in Silas's eyes, something that gave him pause, a hint of a past that was more complicated than that of a simple stableman. He saw a man who was not afraid of violence, but merely tired of it. With a sneer, Fletcher made his decision. "You've been warned," he said, and then he turned on his heel and strode out of the livery, his men falling into step behind him. Silas watched them go, his body not relaxing until they were out of sight. He stood in the silence of his stable, the smell of hay and leather once again the only thing in the air. He had not won. He had only delayed the inevitable. The line had been drawn, and now Fletcher had crossed it. The next move would be Alara's. He could only hope she had the strength to make it. That night, a storm was brewing. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an energy that promised violence. Heat lightning flickered silently on the horizon, illuminating the bruised, purple clouds that were rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the mercantile and sending dust devils skittering down the empty street. Silas was not asleep. He sat in the small room he kept at the back of the livery, a single lamp casting a pool of yellow light on the table in front of him. He was cleaning a gun. It was a Colt Peacemaker, its metal worn smooth with age and use, but its action was clean and precise. He had not worn it since coming to Redemption. He had not needed to. He had hoped he would never need to again. But hope was a luxury, and he was a man who dealt in necessities. He worked with the same patient, methodical care he brought to every other task, the faint smell of gun oil mingling with the scent of the coming rain. He was waiting. He did not know what he was waiting for, but he felt it in his bones, the same way he could feel a change in the weather. The town was asleep, battened down against the approaching storm, but there was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the thunder rumbling in the distance. It was the tension of a story reaching its final, unavoidable chapter. A sound at the livery door, a frantic scratching noise, barely audible over the rising wind. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the gun in his hand, his body moving with a silent, fluid grace. He moved through the darkened stable, his eyes already adjusted to the gloom, and peered through a crack in the heavy wooden door. It was Alara. She was huddled against the frame, her dress soaked through from the first fat drops of rain that had begun to fall. Her hair had come loose from its tight knot and was plastered to her face, and in the stark, intermittent flashes of lightning, he could see that her cheek was swollen and a dark line of blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. She was shaking, whether from cold or fear, he could not tell. He slid the heavy bar on the door and pulled it open just enough for her to slip inside. She stumbled into the stable, collapsing against a pile of hay, her breathing coming in ragged, desperate sobs. She had finally run. He bolted the door behind her and lit a second lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. He saw her clearly now. The bruise on her cheek was fresh, a dark, ugly mark that stood out against her pale skin. Her lip was split, and when she pushed her wet sleeves up to wipe her face, he saw the full story written on her arms. A constellation of old and new bruises, the marks of fingers, the cruel history of her marriage laid bare for him to see. She looked up at him, her eyes wild with terror, but also with a tiny, flickering ember of defiance. He said he was going to kill you," she choked out between sobs. "He's coming here, to burn it down, with you in it." She had not run to save herself. She had run to warn him. The realization hit Silas with a quiet force. In her moment of greatest terror, her first thought had been for him, the stranger who had asked a single, simple question. He felt something shift inside him, a wall he had spent years building cracking under the weight of her courage. He walked over to her, not speaking, and held out a hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her small, cold hand lost in his. He pulled her gently to her feet. "No one is burning anything," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the storm of her fear. He led her to the back of the stable, toward the fastest horse he owned, a powerful black gelding that was more spirit than flesh. "You're going to ride," he said, already throwing a saddle on the horse's back. "You're going to ride west, and you're not going to look back." She shook her head, her eyes still wide with fear. "He'll find me. He'll never stop. He'll have to get through me first," Silas said, and the words were a vow. As he cinched the saddle tight, the livery doors rattled violently. "Silas!" It was Fletcher's voice, distorted by the wind and the rain, filled with a furious rage. "Send her out, Silas! Send out my property, or I swear to God I will burn you both to the ground." Elira flinched, a whimper escaping her lips. Silas placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. He looked into her eyes. "Fear is his weapon," he said, his voice low and intense. "Don't let him use it on you. Not anymore." He finished with the horse and handed her the reins. "Go out the back. Ride hard." Then he turned, the colt now settled comfortably in his hand, and walked toward the front of the stable. The final confrontation was here. He would meet it. Silas unbarred the door and swung it open, stepping out into the wind and the rain. Fletcher was there, a torch in one hand and a shotgun in the other, his face a grotesque mask of fury in the flickering light. His two hired hands were behind him, looking nervous and uncertain in the face of the storm and the quiet, armed man who had just emerged from the stable. The street was empty, but lights were on in the windows of the surrounding houses. The town was watching. Their silence was no longer indifferent. It was the silence of witnesses. "Where is she?" Fletcher screamed over the wind. "She is not your property," Silas said, his voice not raised, yet it cut through the noise of the storm. He stood his ground, the rain plastering his shirt to his chest, the gun held loosely at his side. He was not aiming it. He was simply holding it. Fletcher laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Everything in this town is my property. I own the bank, I own the assayer's office, and I own her. Now step aside." He raised the shotgun. In that split second, a sound cut through the night, the thunder of hoofbeats, not from the front of the stable, but from the side. Elira had not ridden out the back. She had ridden around, emerging into the main street, reining the powerful black horse to a halt beside Silas. She sat tall in the saddle, the rain washing the blood from her face, her eyes fixed on her husband, and in her gaze there was no fear. There was only a cold, clear fire. Fletcher stared at her, momentarily stunned by her defiance. It was the opening Silas needed. He did not raise his gun to shoot. He moved forward, his speed deceptive, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Before Fletcher could react, Silas's free hand shot out and grabbed the barrel of the shotgun, twisting it upward as it discharged with a deafening roar, the buckshot tearing a hole in the sky. At the same time, he brought the heavy barrel of his own Colt down in a short, sharp arc, striking Fletcher's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Fletcher cried out, dropping the shotgun into the mud. The two hired hands, seeing their employer disarmed and broken, exchanged a look and simply melted back into the shadows, wanting no part of a fight that was no longer in their favor. Silas stood over Fletcher, who was now cradling his shattered wrist, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. Silas did not say a word. He just looked at him, his expression cold and final. Then he looked at Elira, who was still watching from the back of the horse. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all she needed. She turned the horse, spurred it into a gallop, and rode out of town, disappearing into the rain in the darkness of the open plains, a free woman riding toward an unknown future. Silas watched her go, then he turned his attention back to the whimpering man in the mud. He bent down, picked up the shotgun, broke it open, and emptied the remaining shell onto the ground. Then he dropped the useless weapon at Fletcher's feet and walked back into his stable, leaving Fletcher alone in the storm, his power, his authority, and his cruelty all washed away by the rain. Weeks later, the town of Redemption settled back into its rhythms. But something had changed. Fletcher, his arm in a sling and his reputation in tatters, sold his house and his holdings at a loss and left on the eastbound stage. His departure, as quiet and unremarked upon as Elira's arrival, had been loud with silent judgment. The house with the white picket fence was bought by the blacksmith's family, and soon the sound of children's laughter could be heard from the garden where Elira had once tended her tomatoes in silent sorrow. The story of that night was told and retold, in whispers at the mercantile, and in hushed tones at the saloon, until it became a part of the town's mythology. Silas, the quiet stableman, became something of a local legend, a man who had faced down a bully, not with bullets, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. But Silas himself did not change. He continued his work, his days still measured by the familiar tasks of mending leather and shoeing horses. The gun went back into its oiled cloth, returned to its place of rest. He did not speak of that night, and he deflected any attempts by the townspeople to praise him. His quiet reserve, a gentle but firm barrier. He had not sought a confrontation, nor had he sought to be a hero. He had simply seen a wrongness and had refused to look away. His life returned to its former solitude, but it was a different kind of solitude now. It was not the solitude of a man hiding from the world, but of a man at peace with it. One afternoon, as the summer heat began to give way to the first hints of autumn, a rider approached from the west. Silas watched from the doorway of his stable as the rider drew closer, recognizing the powerful stride of the black gelding long before he could make out the person on its back. It was Alara. She was dressed not in a worn-out dress, but in sturdy canvas trousers and a simple cotton shirt, the clothes of a person who worked for a living. Her hair was cut shorter, no longer bound in a tight, severe knot, but moving freely in the breeze. She looked stronger, her face tanned by the sun, her shoulders straight and confident. She reined in the horse in front of the livery and dismounted with an easy, practiced grace. She did not look like the frightened, haunted woman who had fled into the storm. She looked like herself. "I found work," she said, her voice clear and steady, "at a ranch about 50 miles west of here, breaking horses." Silas looked at her, and then at the horse she had ridden, an animal that was all fire and spirit, and he felt a slow smile spread across his face. Of course, the woman who had been so controlled had found her calling in gentling wild things, not by breaking them, but by understanding them. "They pay well," she continued, pulling a small, heavy pouch from her saddlebag. She held it out to him. "This is for the horse. I believe we agreed on a price." Silas looked at the pouch, then back at her face. He shook his head. "The horse was a gift," he said. "Consider it payment for a debt." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "No," Silas replied, his voice soft. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten. That makes me indebted to you." He did not say what it was she had reminded him of. He did not need to. It was there in the quiet space between them, an understanding that transcended words. It was the knowledge that true strength wasn't about how much you could endure in silence, but about having the courage to speak and the compassion to listen. Alara held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded, accepting his words. She tied the reins of the black gelding to the hitching post. "I'm leaving him here," she said. "I have my own string of horses now." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you, Silas," she said, the words simple and direct, "for seeing me." Then she walked across the street to the mercantile, her steps sure and confident, a woman who was no longer anyone's property. Silas watched her go, a sense of quiet, profound peace settling over him. The world was still a hard place, but it was not without its moments of grace, and this, he knew, was one of them. Sometimes the loudest thing in the world is a quiet question. In a world full of noise, it's easy to overlook the person standing silently in the storm, to mistake stillness for weakness, and to mind our own business until it's too late. The story of Silas and Alara isn't about a grand battle, but about the small, almost invisible moment when one person chose to see another, truly see them, and had the courage to ask a question that broke the silence. It's a reminder that the deepest wounds are often the ones we can't see, and the greatest strength is not in the fist we raise, but in the hand we offer. It's the simple, powerful truth that our own peace is tied to the peace of others, and that sometimes the only thing required to save a life is to bear witness to it. What do you think is the bravest thing a person can do for a stranger? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being a part of this community. Your presence matters more than you know.